You're coming into town at 12 minutes and you are in the green. All right, folks, thanks for joining us on this Monday morning. I'm Jeff Ealing. We wanted to get right to this story that we have been following. It's actually making national news now. Charges now apparently are on file after a shooting case that left an 11-year-old child dead. Police said that child was involved in what they're calling a doorbell prank. It was over the weekend. ABC 13 reporter Chaz Miller with the very latest details on this now.
So we have learned this morning there is a murder charge that has been filed associated to the address where this alleged shooting took place. This is a story we've been talking about for a few days now. It was late Saturday night, according to HPD. Talking about for a few days now. It was late Saturday night, according to HPD, that an 11-year-old boy was going around with a couple of other people, ringing doorbells and leaving. They said he went to this house on Mimsby, that an 11-year-old boy was going around with a couple of other people, ringing doorbells and leaving. They said he went to this house on Mimsboro, did that, and as he was running away, was shot in the back by somebody. He died the next day in the hospital. Somebody was initially detained and then released, and then detained again, and then released again, according to HPD. But now we have learned that that person is once again in custody and has a murder charge in the system. That individual is expected in court in just a little bit. This morning, we expect to be there to learn more details on this, but that is the big story this morning. There is now a murder charge listed to the address affiliated with this 11-year-old boy who was shot on Saturday after pranking the neighborhood, according to HPD. We will let you know what comes from this court appearance and bring it your way. Until then, reporting downtown, I'm Chaz Miller, ABC 13 Eyewitness News.
Uh, Hello, everyone. How are y'all doing? Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome back, everybody. And um, we talk about this in my uh in my U.S. government class normally, where we talk about what you can, what you can't do, what is stand your ground. And clearly, if someone is running away from you, it doesn't matter if they have robbed you, have stolen a television or whatever. If they're running away from you, then these people are no longer a threat, right? So, and we've seen this happen in Austin. I know, but then that was a jury in Travis County. I suspect the jury in Harris County will have the same outcome um, of a guy who has a history of having uh, all of these, he has an enormous amount of guns, and he felt like shooting at an 11-year-old kid, um, because, he knocked on his door and ran, or rang his doorbell and ran. Um, he felt that it was appropriate, and clearly, I like, a few of you, or maybe many of you in this class, um, would not go into a case like that and being neutral. I'm just not going to be neutral on something like that. So hopefully they get a jury that is neutral, that's able to look at everything. But mm-mm. um, hopefully you had a great weekend. You had a chance to chill and breathe and get yourself reset for the semester as we really get going. That's the upside about this here. We used to do it with well, we do it with the in high schools, and the K through 12, where you get going in the spring, and then you get off for Martin Luther King Day, so you can kind of breathe, and then you get back again. So we're now at it and everything like that. Do you guys have any questions about anything? Everybody have a good understanding about what is and what isn't. I will tell you that the current event is due today. If you have not completed the current event, I know I've graded some, about about five of them or so. You all make sure you get your current event turned in by 11:59 this evening. I don't always, remind you about the current events or assignments being due, but I'm going to remind you today because I just felt like I needed to tell you all. So it is due today. Remember, you can look up you can find any article anywhere that's related to Texas government. Explain how it is related to government. Like, how is this article related to government? In what way? And why is it important? In your opinion. And that's essentially what I'm looking for. It should be a page long. You can use a political cartoon that you might find. You can also use a link. You can just put the link there. It should be a page in length. Does not matter how long the link is, how large the cartoon is that you add to your current event. The actual write-up should always be a page long. So if you make that photo a half a page, I still need a full page write-up about it, or it will not be accepted. Also, I showed you all an example of this on the first day. So you all should have a good idea about what I'm looking for and things like that, a good a sense about it. But ultimately, yeah, that's it. Any questions about that? Okay. So, um, what do you mean? You mean if you turn it in today and it's not right, or if you turned it in wrong and it wasn't right? Okay. Well, so if it was a page, I probably still accept it, but just in the future, just make sure that it's double spaced and it'll be fine. If you get me a more than half of a page, and I see that, and I can kind of look and see that it's double spaced, that at double space it'll be a page. I would accept it the first time or so, so you should be fine. Okay. You can always go in and check it out because I've graded everything this morning, so you could check it out and see how it turns out. If not, you can always reach out to me. All right. Um, from now on, going forward, as we meet in this class, um, I have a new rule that if you are going to turn on your camera, I don't want any lamps in the background. Okay? We can't operate like this. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, what? Some of you might say, well, I'm glad I don't have lamps in my background. But here's the thing. I don't really have that power to tell you not to have a lamp in the background. It's not within our rules at ACC for me to tell you that you can't have a lamp in the background, right? And I want you to understand that just because I'm a professor of the class and I'm telling you that this is my rule and this is what it's going to be and this is my new rule going forward, that doesn't mean I could do it, right? It's important to understand this as we go forward. President Trump tweeted or put on Truth Social um, from an accelerator. I don't know. But President Trump puts out on Truth Social, or I believe it's where he put it out on, that going forward, we will have voter ID from now on, no matter what. And no more mail-in ballots. No more. I'm signing an executive order. Okay, have fun signing it. Like, it doesn't have any teeth. So you signed it. Congratulations. You can write. And I want you to understand that. The president, this is the beauty of this nation, right? If you love the president, then you probably didn't love the president prior to this one, which means I'm pretty sure you're glad that we didn't have executive orders that you could force things through. Just because you end up waking up this morning and it's a different Biden plan Biden that morning. I'm just joking. I'm sure some of you understand that, right? But how the Constitution is set up, right? I mean, and how executive order is set up, the president can only operate within the realms of the Constitution, which is like everybody. They're supposed to only operate within the actual realms of the Constitution, right? The confines of the Constitution or whatever, however you want to see it. And the Constitution, the states have that authority to control elections. Now, if the states are like, hey, man, he said that we're going to have voter ID, so let's go pass a law as a state legislator, and now we're going to have our governor to sign it, and now we have to have voter ID and no more mail-in ballots. Then that's fine, right? Um, what do you mean, John? I guess what I'm saying is that if I'm reading that right, I guess what I'm saying is that just because a president says it does not make it law, you know. Well, you know, just chances are it's hard to find. Chances are you're probably not going to find an honest politician. You know what I mean? It's just not happening. And I'm not saying that to cover for President Trump. I'm saying it because of the history of the world, right? When we talk about the Federalist Papers in there, I'll tell you that the founders, that are our founders in government, we had two sides. We had the side who was in favor of the Constitution, the side who was against the Constitution, and they were both like leaving out things or alleging things that weren't true. You know what I mean? I'll put it like that. They were campaigning. So they were being the most honest people out there. I'll put it like that. You know what I mean? Um, but John, I've all and just to respond to that comment there, I don't know if President Trump is the actual worst of the worst, right? Me personally, we had presidents that owned slaves, so I'm gonna put those guys up above up above this guy here. You know what I mean? That's just me personally, I guess, based on my history. You know what I mean? I'm like, the slave owners are probably at the top. You know what I mean? But you know, I don't know. You know. Um, but yeah, I just want you to understand that all in all, um, that all in all, just because the president says it doesn't mean it's going to be just because the president says it doesn't mean it's law. And I want you to understand this so that you guys are not so upset with the president when he says he's going to do something and he doesn't do it. And I'm not talking about Trump. I'm not talking about Biden. I just mean in general. Like, as you go forth and you're like, the president, if we keep getting these presidents, he said he's going to do this. He didn't do this. He can't do that. Congress has to pass a law. He can try to encourage you to encourage Congress to do it, but he needs you to do this. He needs you to get out there. He is out there talking, trying to convince you to convince the Congress to pass the law because he's not a king, right? And with that, and with him not being a king, we can't always be upset with our president. We can't always be upset with our governor. I mean, I guess we could, but I'm saying in terms of getting things done, when you say these people didn't even get this done because they're actually relying on us to pressure these people into doing so. As we look at local government eventually, then we'll find that our mayors, and many of them don't have power. And it's the city council. And the mayor is just the person that speaks. Everybody listens when the mayor talks. And when the mayor talks, the mayor is trying to convince us, the people, to uh, sort of come on his side and agree with him, to pressure the city council or the Congress in the city, which is the city council, to vote on a particular law and put it in place. All right. And that's the president's job is to be a spokesman, a mouthpiece, and to try to force these members of Congress to go along with them. And in this president's case, He's forcing the states in a sense, right? Well, an executive order is not a law. The executive order is not going to force the state of California to all of a sudden, or Oregon to all of a sudden, no longer do mail-in ballots. The state of Washington State does mail-in ballots. I believe Oregon automatically sends ballots out to people through mail. From what I believe that's the state is Oregon. So these states are not going to listen to it because it doesn't matter. President Trump did a lot of executive orders his first term, and no one really cared. It was just an executive order. It was like the Constitution says you can't do it. No, no, we're not doing it. Now, to Clark's point, um, states do challenge it because you have people within the state who will agree with the president and try to do these things. So states will challenge it in a sense, but the Constitution is pretty much laid out there and says it. That's what it is, right? Now, the Congress can override the states when it comes to to any elections because the Constitution gives the Congress the power to control elections. So Congress can override them. Congress just can't override, and the president can't override, um, the elections for like, they can't override how political parties choose candidates because the political parties are private companies. They're corporations. They're not part of the actual government. So they can't override that there either. So we have all these little small things going on there, but Article 1 in the Constitution says that the Congress has that authority to to handle elections. We leave it to the states because I'm almost certain that most of you don't want to pay more in taxes for all these states' elections around the country. I mean, around the entire nation, right? So, all right. I remember an executive order. Normally are things that apply to the executive branch. The president is the CEO, as we all know from eighth grade or whatever, when you have to do all these things. He's commander in chief. He's the chief executive officer. He's all these things here, right? We had all these titles for him. Well, yeah, if it's under the executive branches, the executive branch, then yes, he has that power just like a CEO would to automatically do this. But the president can't tell Congress that they now have term limits. He can't do an executive order and say Congress now has term limits. He can't do an executive order and say now I'm going to add 8 people to the Supreme Court, right? He can propose that 8 people go to the Supreme Court like FDR did, but the Congress would have to vote on it. It's more to it than just that there. So, all right. I mean, think about it. If he had this power, if it was automatically law, then this wouldn't be a democracy and there's no such thing as checks and balances. And the executive branch is Article 2 instead of Article 1 because the executive branch was supposed to be the second most powerful branch of government after the Congress. Vetoes, they come into play with actual laws being passed. So if Congress passed a law that said, okay, we're not gonna, states will be, or all states will be allowed, or all states from now on will be allowed to do mail-in ballots. It's a right. It's a law now that mail-in ballots would be that there. Now, President Trump, he can say, no, it's not, and he can veto it and stop it. So that's where the veto goes into place when it goes up the channels through Congress, or if it goes up the channels through like even like here at the state level with our Congress, or if it goes from like some city governments where we have a strong mayor where the city council passes a law or votes in favor of something, and the mayor says no, and he vetoes it. So that's where it comes into place. It normally starts with a law being passed, it's moving up the chain, and they stop it. So just to give you an example, Nixon said that the president has the power over the military. He controls it. The Congress said, "No, you don't." He said, "Yes." He said, "Yes, I do. I get to decide if we go to war. We get to do this. We get to do that." And Congress said, "No, you do not." So Congress passed a law that says that the president does not have that power, just to let them know that the Constitution says that Congress has to ultimately declare war, and Nixon vetoed it. But then the Congress all got together and voted um, almost 95% or so, right? Or something like that. Some extremely high number to override the president. So it still went into effect that says the president can't send us into war without the approval of Congress. But technically, the president can send us into war because if he gets us into something and sends the troops and gets it going, then Congress is forced to fund it, or our troops are going to be getting shot at without any without any backing or any money or funding to help out. So. All right. There we go, people. That's your news. That's what's going on. I wanted to mention that because um the executive orders are interesting, and I'll tell you that. All right. Let's get going with where we left where we actually left off at. Um so we left off. I feel like we got are we at Paul? I feel like we got past this. I'm doing this. I'm in three different spots in my classes. Uh, but But we talked about Jim Hogg, I believe, who was the first Texas-born governor. Um,
Yeah,
did I leave off here, people? I'm so sorry.
yeah, around there.
Okay, cool. Cool. I just wanted to make sure. Um, thank y'all. I appreciate it. Um, oh, the Tidelands. Oh, so we were really moving. Oh, okay, cool, cool. There we go. So we talked about Eisenhower and the Tidelands and ultimately the Gulf of Mexico and how all of the oil is out there and yeah, and there we go. And we ultimately voted Republican in that election. All right. Remember, Texas had been voting Democrat. Texas voted Republican in this election for the first time. So for a president, right? Which was a big deal because Texas was a Democratic state. Now, we have two groups, the Shivercrat and the Loyalists. The Shivercrats were people who actually were followers of Alan Shivers. And they believed in splitting the vote, right? If we're going to vote for president, then we're going to vote for a Republican. And we're going to vote in any type of state offices. It doesn't matter if it's someone who's going to serve in the U.S. Senate. If we're voting for them here in the state, then we're going to vote for a Democrat, right? The loyalists argued, no, you should vote Democrat no matter what. And this was Ralph Yarborough, right, who actually led this. He was a senator, and you can argue that these were the actual liberal, the actual liberal part of the Democratic Party, right? We're going to vote Democrat no matter what. Doesn't matter who's on the ballot or what's on the ballot. We're going to vote Democrat. Have any of you ever heard of Shivercrat? Okay. Well, I'll tell you. The Shibocrats will be it will show up. Shibocrats like EJ Davis tends to appear over and over, tends to reappear throughout the throughout the course. I'll tell you that there, right? This is someone who advocates for splitting the vote, for voting Republican for president and Democrat for state offices. Okay, everyone. Hopefully everybody's ready so I can give you a rundown of all this. All right. So here we go. So at the start, right, we have the Whigs, which is a more liberal party, right, at the start of our nation. And we had the Jeffersonian Republicans, who would, we could argue would be the more conservative, or they had more of like a conservative libertarian type views, right? Ultimately, so we have the elections, and these Whigs are winning, and all this, right? Most of these elections and things like that. And we also get some Jeffersonian Republicans to win. Clearly, Jefferson was a president, right, at one time. So ultimately, we get to like 1821, 22 or so. Now I have to tell you all, right? The argument has been for a long time that, who could vote in our country, right? Let me ask you, right? Who could vote in our country early on? Who?
Men.
Land owning white men.
I love it. Men, owning white men. Here's the interesting
Except for
thing.
Irish.
Well, here's the thing, right? She said white men. They're not. No, I'm just joking.
Oh, that was bad. That was
Come on, these people, they were not white men until like 1880. No, but but here's the interesting thing, right? We were always told this in school, but when you really look at it and you find out, it was not land owning white men. It was basically any white man right now in this country who's a millionaire. It was men of substance. So think about it. Every white man in the country who's at least a millionaire, or who's a millionaire, they can ultimately vote. Now, is that all white men? Clearly, no. So it wasn't until like 1822 or so did all white men get the ability to vote. And that was technically when we start to call our country a true democracy, because we had a large group of people. Now all these people can actually vote. And here's the crazy thing, right? Up until then, the Whigs have been winning a bunch of elections. So now we get all white men ability to vote, and they're all behind this guy named Andrew Jackson, who was a Democrat. And he was an extremely ultra conservative, right? Andrew Jackson is just super conservative guy, right? And he creates this party, the Jacksonian a Democratic Party, basically pulls all of these Jeffersonian Republicans and all these other folks who can now vote, and they're all in the same party. When we get to 1824 and they come out and vote, and no one gets enough electoral votes, so it goes to the House of Representative. House of Representative says, we're not choosing those people. We're choosing John Quincy Adams as president. So they chose him. But 4 years later, in 1828, this large white male voting sector came back in force, and they won the presidency and almost every other office. And now Andrew Jackson is there, and this super ultra conservative party is controlling everything in the country. And they won, and from 1828 to like 1860, this party is in control, just running everything, right? Now we know what happened, right? In 1860, Abraham Lincoln accidentally wins, right? So he wins because there's a split between the two Democrats and things like that. Abraham Lincoln is part of this new third party that somehow became a major party because he won. And this party is a party of a bunch of liberals from like Whigs and others who couldn't win an election because the conservatives were controlling everything. Abraham Lincoln wins. They have a war. After the war, the Republican Party, the party of, these liberals, they controlled everything from like 1860 something or so to like 1930, right? Why? Because in the 1920s, we have the Great Recession and ultimately the Great Depression happened shortly thereafter. Now, you cannot win an election being a Republican. It's just not going to happen because the Republicans are the people who caused the Great Depression. So, what happened? All of those liberals and the Republican Party ran to the Democratic Party because that's the only party that's out there. That's the only way that you're going to win the election because people didn't understand ideology. People didn't understand what a liberal and conservative was, but they understood what a Democrat was and what a Republican was. And now this party is packed with everybody, right? It has Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama. I mean, just imagine that, right? It has everybody in the party, right? Because that's the only party in town, right? Now, we get FDR who wins the election, right? He becomes the president. FDR won 4 elections. Was FDR an amazing president? I don't know. Maybe I think he did a great job, but I don't know if he was 4 term great, right? The issue is that FDR was a Democrat. He kept winning the Democratic ticket, and no one was going to vote for any Republicans because they didn't want to go back to the Great Depression, right? They also didn't realize that they were voting for a liberal at at the presidency and excited because this liberal won because he's one of them because he shares the same a party label while still voting for ultra conservatives down here in Texas because these guys are Democrats and we know that conservatism is housed in that party. Now, eventually, LBJ wins. He signs the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act in the 60s, and we start to see a bunch of conservatives leave after that there, right? He even said it. He said, we're going to lose the South for the next 50 years. He was lying. It's longer than that. It was going to be longer, clearly, right? So conservatives start to leave the Democratic Party. They say, you can have it. They move to the Republican Party. And now, and then after Ronald Reagan shows up, all the other conservatives, right? Those, when they call Ronald Reagan, they say he had Democrats and he had Republicans who were on his side. Yes, but many of those Democrats were conservatives. So they eventually moved over. And now the conservatives are housing the Republican Party. The liberals are housing the Democratic Party, right? And that's how the party's ideologies have switched over time. So I always tell students, if someone tells you that the Democratic Party used to do this or the Republican Party used to do that, then you simply have to ask, when? Like, what year are you talking about? Because I can tell you the type of people who was housing that party. Doesn't mean that those are the same people who are alive now sharing that same view, but you got to understand ideology, and ideology is very important. And when you look at Texas, Texas is not red or blue. It's not Democrat or Republican. It's just conservative. And you know which party is a conservative party, all based on the party that Texas is voting for all the time. Right? There we go, people. If you were wondering. All right. So we get this thing called the Sharpstown scandal, which is interesting because This is you get a bunch of leading Democrats here in the state, right? And these guys, it was a mixture of liberals and conservatives, right? But they were all Democrats, and they were stealing money and stuff like that, or using money, using taxpayer money to do things. And the interesting thing is that Frank Sharp, the owner of Sharpstown Bank. If you ever been to Houston, we have a Sharpstown area down there, right? But they had been doing illegal stuff, and they got caught because they used state money to buy a pickup truck, and it was able to trace all the way back to all that there. That's the interesting thing there, right? First off, these guys are probably worth tens of millions of dollars, but they still wanted to go buy a pickup truck with state money, which is how they end up getting caught, right? But there we go. It did hurt their party a lot. And the weird thing, or I don't know if it's weird, but the interesting thing about this is that there were many conservatives involved in many of these things that were happening. They ultimately left and went to the Republican Party. And the people of Texas were like, we don't trust the Democratic Party for what they've done. So we're going to vote for the other party. But the other party happened to be many other guys who they didn't trust in the first place. They just switched parties. Right. Now, EJ Davis, we had him first. And our, in many textbooks, it will tell you that Bill Clements is the first Republican governor of Texas, but he's not the first one, right? They don't, many books they don't even count EJ Davis as a governor, because they felt like he didn't win. He was forced upon them, but he did win. Anyway, he was the first Republican governor in Texas since EJ Davis, and he wins. It didn't change anything. Why? Because he was a Republican who was a conservative working with a bunch of conservative Democrats, since there were many conservatives still housed in that particular party. So, yeah. Here we go. So, in the 1980s, right, we get House Bill 72. It says that teacher salaries are going to be raised, right? We're going to raise the standards for the students and teachers. The teachers will have to be certified to teach. If you don't pass the certification, then you don't get to teach. Which everyone's like, good job, we like it. Then they said, we have no pass, no play. If you don't pass, you don't get to play sports or take part in UIL activities. And let me tell you, this right here led to an uproar, right? People were like, I'm fine with all the other stuff, but football has to be played. And I think it's great, right? Because now coaches focus heavily on scholar athletes, right? Understand that everybody's not going to go to college or get a scholarship or go pro or whatever, right? And ultimately, you need to learn the skills that are needed to get a career, right? At least. So, um, there we go. Also, we started to see a shift, right? In a heavily Democratic state, a Democratic state since Richard Koch when EJ Davis left, and prior to that, at least, right? We started to see Republicans get elected. We saw some get elected to the Supreme Court and one to the Texas Railroad Commission. So we started to see a shift. We started to see a shift. It's interesting because Governor Bill, oh my gosh, I can't remember his name. Bill White actually ran for governor. He was mayor of Houston. But Governor Mark White, um, he's the one who put this law into place, right? That there's no pass, no play. And I gotta tell you, I was listening to him give a presentation. Or he was talking at a His name, conference or something. I don't know what Bill it was, White, right? actually It ran was like for my early days in college, like I don't know, '02 or some '03 or something like that, '01. But anyway, he's talking and he says, you know, he's a lot of people that thought that I couldn't win another election in Texas because of no pass, no play. He was like, a lot of people think, thought that I'm not going to win because he was not going to be reelected after that went into effect, right? That was the thing he pushed for. They got it and he passed it and he was happy about it. And he was like, a lot of people think that's why I didn't win. He was like, really? A lot of people were mad about that. I mean, a lot of people were upset about that, but they weren't mad. He said he got death threats for one of his other laws that he put into place. He said he got death threats from people saying if we catch you out here in East Texas, we're gonna string you up. People were people were sending him mail and threatening this guy, and he put a law into place which led to that, all these threats, and that law was that you had to wear a seatbelt. There's a seatbelt law. All right, he put a seatbelt law into place and started getting death threats. I remember riding with my grandfather in the 1980s in the car, and we were riding, and we didn't have the seatbelts that came down. It was just the one. It was like the one that went around at our waist. And I got in the car with him in the front seat at a young age, which I probably should have been there, but hey, it's the 80s, so everything goes. So anything goes. I used to go in the store to purchase cigarettes from my dad back then. It was legal. But anyway, I'm in the front seat with him, and my grandpa is riding, holding that seat belt. I look over at him and I say, Granddaddy, I can put that in for you. He's like, I'm not putting that seatbelt in. These people try to tell you what to do. And we drove like 18 miles, and he held that seatbelt the whole time. He was committed to not putting that seatbelt on. I thought it was crazy because it seemed easier if you just plug it up. Plus, it's safer. That's what I was taught by my parents. But it just goes to show that these people were really angry about the governor trying to keep them safe. It was weird. Right? Here we go, people. The State Board of Education. We found out very quickly um, that there's a lot of power and influence at the lowest level, right? If you can get to those kids early on and teach them something, then you can basically, as they put, you can indoctrinate them or you can educate them. Depending on how you feel about what's being taught, you're probably going to interpret it different ways, right? But as you see here, right, we get the State Board of Education that adopted the first elementary and high school biology text since 1960 that contain a thorough explanation of Darwin's theory of evolution, right? Um, and pictures of male and female reproductive systems and information on puberty were removed from high school health books. Okay, guys, listen, I graduated in the 90s. The late 1990s. Uh, and let me tell you, we had anatomy and physiology books where it was like a gray book, right? And on and in the reproductive system section, a chapter, yes, it did have male and female reproductive systems in there, but it also had, I guess, a woman in the process of having a baby. It was like crowning, if you know what I mean. Like you can see a baby on its way out, right? So you can see like the baby's hair or whatever. And it was in our books, right, in high school. And and it's wild because those books were actually referenced as to why they need to take it out because it would discourage abstinence. And I didn't really understand. I didn't know anyone. I mean, I didn't look at that picture. I don't think anyone in our school looked at that and thought, "Oh man, look at that. I think we should go have sex or whatever." But that's not how the state legislature saw it. That's not how our governor saw it. That's not how many people saw it. They were like, "That's going to encourage it." I would assume if you're, because they showed us a video in school of someone going through pain having children, which they probably showed y'all in ninth grade. I'm sure you've seen that to discourage you from doing that, right? I don't know if that's even being shown anymore, right? Where they show you a video on all this stuff here. But Texas has gone through this whole thing of understanding that we have to take control of the State Board of Education so that we can control what's being taught, so that we can encourage people not um, to be loose, I guess. 1994, Texas become a two-party state, meaning that both parties have a chance of winning an election. And also Dan Morales, he's important, so write that down. Um, is the first Mexican American to be elected as Attorney General or to an executive office, and he was elected as Attorney General. Okay. All right. Now, we also get Ann Richards, aka Bailey Hutchison, right? Ann Richards is on, well, you see her, it has her name there. Ann Richards, she was our governor from 1991 to 1995. Amazing governor. She was hilarious, right? She was a great speaker. And even Kay Bailey Hutchison was or is an amazing or was an amazing politician. I think she's still alive, but she's no longer in office. Like most of us thought that um that John McCain was going to choose her as his running mate against Barack Obama, and many people were nervous because Kay Bailey Hutchison was a pro-choice conservative, so she was extremely conservative, but her thing was, I'm still a woman first. So when it came to things when it dealt with like females, I don't know where how far you go with pro-choice, but hers is in terms of like of her gender being a female when it comes to abortion, when it comes to birth control pills, when it comes to things like this here. So a lot of people thought that he was going to choose her, and he ended up not choosing her, and he chose Sarah Palin instead. Hutchison won to office in the U.S. Senate in 1992. So she took office then, and she ultimately joined Phil Gramm in the U.S. government, in the U.S. Senate, and it was the first time since E.J. Davis's time that two Republicans represent us in the U.S. Senate, right? And she joined Phil Gramm.
What year was that again?
That was 1992. Actually, a fun fact: New York Times. New York Times. The time is it a Times magazine? It's that magazine. I think it's called Times. They put out an article. They put this thing out called it "The Year of the Woman," and that's because all of these women had been elected to Congress that year in 1992, and in the year of the woman, 14 women had been elected to the Congress, and they thought it was a huge deal. So that lets you know how uneven it was, right? So when it came to women, in politics and in Congress and things like that. Now here comes George Bush. He shows up. He becomes a governor of Texas. Him and Ann Richards had an amazing election. Ultimately, he wins, and now the Republican Party has a majority in the Texas Senate for the first time since E.J. Davis. Okay. Last time under E.J. Davis, when they had control, these people were all liberals. Now they took control, they're all conservatives. I just wanted you to kind of see the kind of things that went through and stuff like that, where you see like the Republicans win. We get the deregulation of companies, especially electric companies. We saw the prices increase. Even under Rick Perry, he deregulated college tuition. It was it was a cap on colleges at first, and he deregulated it. And if you look here, look at number two. What's interesting about the second bullet? What do you think? Well, the interesting thing, I'll tell you what it is that when it comes to piercing, there were many places who would allow guys to get piercing, but when females showed up, they would have to have their parents' permission. Also, you need your parents' permission um, to also get an abortion if you're underage. Anyone think that's a good law? Anyone think it's a bad law?
I think for the abortion part, that's understandable, but the piercing part, it doesn't make sense why a girl would need a parent's permission to get a piercing.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if they still do it now, but I know back in the day, all the girls had ice cubes and they stuck it on that ear and just held it there and pushed through. I don't know if that's still a thing. I don't know if people are still doing that. Um, but it was a real thing back in the day. Um, yes, Clark is right. So kids in Texas are property, but the argument is, even goes further than that, right? It's who is responsible for a child? It's the parents. Who's responsible for the child's medical? Anything medical, right? Let's just say that your child is going to have an operation. Who has to pay for this or sign off on it and pay for this? Well, it's the parents. And I would assume that, or it's assumed that it's not because, or the argument is that it's not because of, we don't want the kids to have an abortion. It's because the parents, have a right to know, and the parents are ultimately responsible for these children's medical costs and things like that. And things could ultimately go wrong during an abortion. I guess the issue would be, are is there something going on between the kid and the parent? And that's why many states back then said that you had to have a parent's permission, or you had to have a guardian's permission to get an abortion, but it couldn't be a dad, or it couldn't be a male. It had to be a female, who actually went with you and things like that. Um, I will say this here. So, so let's go off of Clark's comment here, or what was a type there. Um, let's just say there's a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old who is pregnant. Who has control over the 13-year-old?
Their parent or legal guardian.
Okay, a 13-year-old gives birth and has a baby. Who has control over the child? The 13-year-old wants the baby father to come get the child, or wants to leave their child with someone else or whatever. Who has control over the child of the 13-year-old?
There's the rub. It gets confused, huh?
Oh, it's not confused. Not in Texas. Pretty straightforward stuff. Look, Clark, it would be confused in my house if it's my daughter.
So it would still be the parents?
It would be the 13-year-old has control of their child. Because as
Oh,
Clark says, kids in
Oh,
Texas are property. The 13-year-old gets to decide where their child goes. The 13-year-old can't go with their child. Like you can say, okay, I want my child to go with them. Okay, that's
yeah,
fine, but you're gonna stay here. Like you can't go anywhere because you still have control over the 13-year-old. You see what I'm saying? And they do
yeah.
that because the whole idea is to really drive in the parents have control over their children here. But to Clark's point, it will get confused and blurred because if it was my child, I'm like, no, no, this is my house. You stay here and the kid, like until you get older, because I'm sure my child isn't gonna go look up a law. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That is a gray area because if you're my child, yeah, that, you're my child. So you don't have a job. You're 13. You don't have a job. You have no way of having your own housing and things like that. That's a lot to consider. And my grandchild, that's a part of me. So I would probably want to claim the grandchild as mine as well.
yeah, and
I,
to
I, I do get what Clark is saying and what you're saying, and there's that gray area there. So
right, and I guess it gets weird because the 14-year-old boy who got her pregnant, his family feels the same way, and they want to see the child too. You know what I mean? So
yeah.
becomes one of those things there. So, um, also the whole blood alcohol level and driving. I don't know if that's a big deal anymore in Texas. I think that the bigger deal in Texas, which Justice Scalia passed away, like right before this, and this was his baby that he wanted to address, and him, um, and um, and also Ginsburg, they were good friends, right? And they wanted to address the actual no refusal weekend thing. And it looked like it was going to be overturned to stop people from having to being able to say, no, I don't want to, I don't want to do this here. Like say, because each state had like different rules of how much time it would take for the alcohol to ultimately leave the body and stuff. So they were going to pass. So it was addressed I mean, at the Supreme Court. And ever since then, the Supreme Court hasn't taken up the case. But the Supreme Court was looking to take up that case. That was one of those big cases that was coming up that we knew the Supreme Court was going to ultimately rule on whether or not no refusal violates the Fourth Amendment in the Constitution. You know what I mean? So, yeah. And they did not. And when you listen to these guys talk, like Ginsburg and Scalia, they were clearly both. They were skeptical. I'll use that word about these laws and things like that were ultimately in place because they were like, well, if it takes X amount of time for it to get out of the body, then why does this state have this and this state has this and this state has that? So, but I will say that with 2019, I'm sure many of you remember this if you were in Austin around 2019, like we had like 30 or 20, 30 people die in car accidents like before May or something. It was some weird number. I don't know if you remember that. It was so many accidents that now it seemed to be no refusal weekend all the time. Right. Texas does love to drink. All right. And you know what? I heard that it's illegal to drink and ride a horse. I did not even know that was illegal. But apparently that's illegal as well, according to a cousin of mine who was on a horse drunk. So that's apparently illegal as well. So you know, just be safe, people. I didn't know how he even got on the horse, right? So
So did he get a ticket?
yes, he did. He got a ticket for
That's fine. Good to know.
In South Carolina and in New York State, you can get a DUI for riding a horse and
Okay, then
intoxicated.
see, so there we go. Yeah, all right, then. So
Texas ain't that strange.
I was like, I'm not on horses, so it's not something I've had to come around to or even understand. But yeah, that was weird. I was like, boy, you always into something, man. You need to chill. So, but okay. So a moralistic, an individual, a political, a traditional. These are the three types of cultures here in Texas. One, the moralistic, which is concerned with right and wrong in politics. So it's basically, okay, what's right and wrong? So we're going to look in terms of using the golden rule and things like that. Look, it is our job to help everyone else, right? As we move forward, the entire nation moves forward together, or the entire state moves forward together, right? And when we look at government, it's a positive force, right? And they ultimately work to help the people. They're not trying to make a bunch of money and things like that. But what they're trying to do is just to help everyone grow and things like this. And we saw this early on in the New England area when we quickly got the public schools and things like that, because the whole idea was to help a nation move forward together versus part of it and the others not. Now, I will tell you that a lot of this it didn't always come from just wanting to do what's right for people. Like a lot of this came from that old way that had been passed down of if you don't help people, then you're going to be punished later, right? Kind of like if someone's house catches fire, then that must be a sign from God and things like that. But ultimately, if you're not helping people, then clearly you're on the actual wrong side of um, or you end up on the actual wrong side of the afterlife, right? So the individualistic or the individual political, right? So these are things that we find in like Ohio, Michigan, those mid-Atlantic states and things like this, right? Where now we're looking at government, and the government's job is to work with business to help its people, right? So, uh, so we have government, and they're gonna talk with the companies, corporations, and ultimately, maybe use a mindset of lower taxes which will ultimately help the businesses because they have low taxes. In return, these businesses are going to pay the people more and hire more people, and everybody's happy, right? Me personally, on a personal note, right? This is not fact, right? This is not something you should write down and keep unless you like it, right? But ultimately, on a personal level, I've never really, I've always leaned toward taxing people that make more money, at a higher level, right? Because we have like incremental, which we'll go over in our public policy lecture, where you'll see what I mean. It doesn't mean I'm gonna tax all of your money at 40%. It's just everything over $8 million that, and up will be taxed at that rate. It's not everything, right? But we'll go over the incremental budgeting. But I've always felt as though like with companies, they should be taxed less, right? So the corporations are taxed less or none, right? If we have entered into an agreement with the government that you guys are going to hire the people and pay them, a wage that's clearly well above a living wage. You know what I mean? So let's just say that, okay, I'm not going to tax, you know, Apple, and in return, Apple is going to operate here in my state, and Apple is going to hire 1,200 people, and they're all going to get paid at least $50,000 or more a year. So it sort of works out. Now the people are paying higher taxes maybe in the state, but it's fine because the people are getting paid a lot more than that. It still offsets everything. And guess what? I get reelected over and over again because you guys are happy that you're making money and things like that. So it all works out and stuff. And that's what we saw in here. And that's what it kind of got going as our middle class started to get going and growing and things like that. So we had all these things in place. So, but ultimately, that's in those areas there. Lots of labor unions and things like that. The traditional culture comes from the plantation society of the Old South, right? Where we use government, where actually government is used to maintain religious social values, right? Look, the whole idea is that you work hard. That's not something that you are sitting there relying on everyone else to do, right? It's the bootstrap mentality and things like that. And it's the job of our government to ensure that those religious values they ultimately remain in a around and to reinforce the social values as well. It's not the job of the government to help the people at least, right, and things like that, or to sponsor the people, right? But when you look at it, right, Texas is actually a blend of the traditional culture and the individualistic culture, which is the culture of government working with business and helping business. The problem is that Texas is not a moralistic culture, which is what we got like in Ohio and places like that, where it's that other part where, okay, fine, you know, it's not the government's job to help people, right? Like that, or to sponsor people and things like that. Everyone needs to work on their own, which is fine. The problem is that we have that mentality of everyone needs to work on their own. Things shouldn't be handed to people. And we have the mindset of, as a government, we should hand money to corporations and companies. Right, right. We don't get the other side of what is the corporation giving back to us? Because if we're handing money to these people, it's coming out of our taxes, right? At least is the argument being made. So just remember that Texas is a blend of, of the individualistic and the traditional culture. Okay. Political culture, right? And as Daniel Elazar writes, a political culture is the pattern, is a particular pattern of orientation to political action in which each political system is embedded. So what does that exactly mean, right? So what it basically means is that a nation's laws are tailored to the political culture, right? We have a good sense about the type of laws that are going to come out, all based on the political culture, right? Watch this. So I'm gonna say a word, and you tell me if these people are in favor of it. Okay, abortion, Mississippi.
Against.
Okay, New York.
No one's really in favor of abortion. They're in
Okay, I'm
favor
sorry.
of
I'm
choice.
sorry. Abortion rights,
Okay,
the right to have an abortion. I apologize.
thank you.
There we go. She's about to take me to town there. Hold on, wait. People aren't just aborting things, okay? They just want a right to. Um, so I want you to kind of understand that, right? And with that understanding, what Elazar argues is that you kind of know the kind of laws that are going to come out of a place all based on its culture, right? So no matter what this argument is, right? If there's an argument on whether or not to expand voting rights or whether to allow more money to be given for a financial aid or something, I don't know, right? You can come up with things. Then you got a good sense about how these states will ultimately vote. But then you have those states like Indiana, right? Or Colorado now, right? That's confusing because it could go one way or another, right? So we have these type of things, but in many of the cases, we have a good sense about the type of laws that are going to come out. So when you look at culture, culture is created by the history of that particular area, by something that has happened or just a history that's been passed down and things like this. And this is why Elazar argues that it's important to understand the history which allows us to understand the culture. And Elazar and others have argued this here, have made this argument. So, question, is there a link between the go it alone ethic of the frontier and the actual modern day Texas conservative culture? Is there a link between the go it alone ethic of the frontier and the modern day Texas conservative culture?
Even the term bootstrap. Pulled themselves up by their bootstraps.
Mm-hmm. So you think that that is linked to it as well?
Yes.
You know, it's interesting, right? Have to think about it. So I I've even back to the Flintstones. I don't know if you ever watched that, right? That show, right? Even back to that there, right? When you think of Texas, what do you think of? Right? Like what does media wants you to think of when you think of Texas? Well, there's a history that has been kind of changed in things like this. Or as we learn, the history we had a lot of things that were changed later on in our textbooks and things like that, right? When you think of the Confederacy, do you instantly think of Texas? Because I would argue that most people will not. Most people do not think, oh, that's Texas, right? And I tell you this because Texas in the early 20th century and then the 1900s, early 1900s, put money toward changing the history or changing the outlook of our history, right? We start talking about other things and stuff like that to change the history of Texas so that even though we were part of the Confederacy, we wouldn't be seen as part of the Confederacy all the time, right? Add to the fact that now we have changed that there, and now we're looking at how was this state started? How did we get going? And there's an interesting thing with this here, right? Because that whole go it alone ethic basically means that you showed up and nothing was here, and you created it on your own, right? It discounts the fact that this was Mexico and the Mexicans were here, right? What I said once, I said 1,000 times. I assume that people were saying that the Mexicans were just walking in circles, just waiting for someone to show up and tell them how to live, to tell them how to build a home, to tell them how to farm and stuff. Because clearly, the Mexicans, they didn't know any better until we got here, I guess. All right. But this history has been shaped and passed down from generation to generation through music and novels and books and poems and stories and all these things, even movies, passed down from generation, generation, generation to give a sense that someone went at it alone and did it on their own. That there was no one else to assist them. There was no one else to tell them how this was done and that was done. Interesting stuff, right? So let's elaborate on this as we look at Modi Assi Boatwright, right? Modi Assi Boatwright talks about the myth, oh, the myth of the frontier individualist. And in this, right, Modi talks about how as we look at the old way or that view of go it alone, right? Right, a guy came here by himself and he made something of himself, right? And he and he built the home. And apparently, as Modi says, right, these people want us to truly believe, as I'm putting it in my own words, uh, they want us to believe that folks came here and nothing was going on and no one was here and they didn't get any help. They also want us to believe that even if they did show up in a field and they built a home, that when someone else showed up who looked like them, most likely, right, and they began to build, this guy just had a seat on his porch and he just watched them build over there, right? They didn't help each other out or anything like this, right? And as Modi says, when you look at the history of Texas, right, at these immigrants who came here, right, yes, they had slaves that did work for them at times, but others didn't, right? And the ones that didn't, they came together in groups. Guy, his wife, his brother-in-law and his wife, and his brother and his wife, and his father-in-law came, and they all came together and they began to build, right? Even if they didn't, they showed up, just like we see immigrants do now, who find each other. They work together. They create these institutions of cooperations, right? And they go in together to build schools and churches and houses and things like this. And they're assisting each other and helping each other to grow as a community. Or as Modi C. Boatwright puts it, the reminiscences of the trail drivers of Texas stress mutual help and not individualism. I mean, Texas is part of the Southern hospitality mindset. And I know what you're thinking to yourself. Like, what is he saying? Like, what are you trying to say, man? Get to it. Explain the whole point of this whole Modi Boatwright thing and the individualism. Okay, fine. People worked with each other. They helped each other out and things like this here. It wasn't a go it alone. Yeah, they probably got there alone and they worked with each other. Fine. I get it. But what point are you trying to make? Well, the point is this here. If you embed in someone that they did this on their own, that your great 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 grandfather worked by himself and no one helped him. He built it with his hand and no other hands. That the entire state got started by people working by themselves without any assistance from anyone else. And now we have this amazing state here that was built by individuals doing it on their own and not relying on others. Well, it gives you cover for modern laws that are in place that allows for us to be okay with not helping others by telling everyone to stand up on your own, by telling everyone it's a personal thing to help yourself. It's not the public's job to assist each other. There's no longer a my brother's keeper type mindset. It's all about you being on your own. And as Daniel Elazar says, right, when you create a society like this, when you create a mindset like this, right, and now it's passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation to generation, and it makes it here, it becomes embedded in us that it's not that we don't want to help people, it's that our state has become this amazing state because we didn't help each other. Imagine being taught that this is how it worked out. We worked with each other. We helped each other. Everyone worked, but we cooperated. Some people needed help with this, and we helped them with that, and all this here, which has ultimately led to this amazing state. Imagine a type of culture that we would have now. Thank y'all. And I'll see you, or you'll see me at least, on Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Don't forget about the current event.
Professor, you have a minute?
I do.
Okay. I'm a little bit overwhelmed with the